Hello, and welcome to Season 14, Episode 6 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I'm Mark Bishop.
and we are, of course, reading Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, this time talking about liberal conservatives, in particular Macaulay, Cooper, and Tocqueville. Kind of an interesting collection of people here. Kind of interesting how he defines liberal conservatives as well. I thought his discussion on Tocqueville was the most interesting by far out of these three figures. I think Tocqueville is definitely the most important of these three. But I don't know, what would you think of this chapter?
That was good. I didn't know anything about the other two.
Yeah, neither did I.
Showing my ignorance this season.
Yes, yes.
That's why you
Uh,
read books, right? So you can learn stuff.
that's exactly right. I think that's what they're for.
Either that or for kindling.
Very true. Yeah, any thoughts before we just sort of get started?
Um, no, how about you?
No, I don't think so. I think this is one we can just jump right in.
Pretty straightforward. I mean, it's just talking about three guys who had made some, arguments in the around the same era, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I did like that there was a mention of H.L. Mencken
hmm
in this chapter, who I've read some of his stuff, and he has. Oh, I should have wrote it down. Actually, he has that quote that I love.
About democracy.
Oh, well, no, he's got a lot of really anti-democratic quotes.
Yes.
He was an interesting character.
hmm
I was introduced to him by Books Galore. Uh,
hmm
he suggested Mencken to me, I think, uh, and he has a book. I haven't gotten through it all. Of course, that's what I do. I buy books, read them for a little bit, and then I put them aside. But it's Mencken. Was it Christectomy? Is that what it's
Christomathy.
Yeah,
Christomathy. Yeah.
I always get that wrong. No, this is the quote. Every normal man must be tempted at times to spit upon his hands, raise the black flag, and begin slitting throats. H.L.
Hmm.
Mencken.
Hmm. hmm That's good. That's good.
He was a very acerbic
Yes.
political commentator, syndicated columnist, author. Um, interesting character, Mencken.
Yes. Yes. Very interesting.
I was interested. I've never. I was introduced to him fairly recently. I mean, that was probably within 10 years, I
Yeah.
guess. And I never even heard of the guy before,
Yeah.
but he was very influential in
Yeah.
his time. I guess the 1930s, maybe.
Yeah. I have one of his books sitting on my shelf. I haven't read it. It's actually an abridged version because the actual thing is super, super long. But it's
Yeah.
on the American language. So it's like his study
Mhm.
of American English. I haven't cracked it open yet, but it seems very interesting. But he is not, unfortunately, the topic for today. The
Yes.
topic is these liberal conservatives, and he sort of describes, here at the very beginning, what exactly he's talking about here, because really these people are sort of in the classical liberal tradition rather than a conservative tradition per se. But he says here on page 161, he says, "We are in danger." He says, "At this time, British American liberalism began to flirt with collectivism near the end of the 19th century. He says, we are in danger of forgetting how strongly attached the old liberals were to liberty.
Yeah.
Political liberalism before the middle of the 19th century was conservatism of a sort it intended to conserve liberty." So that was sort of the animating principle of these three figures, Macaulay, Cooper, and Tocqueville, that they were very opposed to the direction that liberalism was going towards this collectivism, towards this utilitarianism that we've talked about a little bit already. And they were wanting to really try and conserve their views of liberty as sort of the defining principle of civil life, right? And so they're really liberals, but liberals that are of a sort of conservative stripe, that they want to conserve the institutions that they think preserve liberty the best. And he says, Macaulay's very much in sort of Burke's tradition. Tocqueville's works are shot through with Burke's ideas. So he keeps going back to Edmund Burke as sort of this arch conservative. His ideas, he argues, are very much present in all of these people in some capacity, even if they're not sort of strictly within the conservative sort of school of thought, as some other figures are more strictly.
Yeah, and his description of Macaulay, I just kind of was kind of confused why he's
hmm
promoting him. I guess. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what influence he had, either short term or long term, and
Yeah.
according to the author, I mean, I've never even heard of him. But of course, it's maybe just because I'm just ignorant of the subject. But I don't know. I mean, he has interesting views about, um, exclusion of people to the franchise, the vote,
Hmm.
which seems to be a theme in this book up to this point, at least, of the conservatives really wanted to at that time really wanted to limiting the people or the categories of people that could vote,
Hmm.
and the dangers of um, what they think is like too much representative democracy, I guess.
Right.
Too many voices, and it really is just it's still, even though we're now into whatever chapter it is, and it's mentioned almost every chapter, it's still a little alarming to hear these arguments because you just never hear them.
Right. Right.
And the only one I ever hear making arguments about people not voting is me. I mean, and I do it a little tongue in cheek, and it's only, and
Mhm.
I'm not trying to limit your right to vote.
Right.
I'm just trying to convince you not to vote.
Hmm.
Like you have a right to vote, but I just don't think you should. And I find these advocates for more voting and get out the vote. Why are you doing that?
Hmm.
Um, but really they want to get out the votes because they want to just pad their side, which that's all well and good.
Right.
But to hear the actual reason argument saying no, there's a bunch of people shouldn't be voting, because
Yeah.
of who they are. It's just and I understand what they're saying. Um, if you're not invested um, in the community and you haven't attained a leadership role, you don't own property and all that, then maybe you shouldn't.
Right.
But I mean, I get it, but I don't agree with it as a
Right.
or
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, he's got kind of an interesting perspective. He's got a great name too. Thomas Babington Macaulay is his full name, which is just such an English name, it sounds to me. But he says he's really kind of a paradoxical guy, and he talks about this on page 165. But kind of throughout that, he's sort of very anti-democratic because he's very pro-liberty, and he sees right the increasing democratic institutions as really infringing upon people's liberty, which is an interesting perspective. And he sort of talks about this paradox right in his thought on page 165. He says, throughout life, he exhibited an increasing uneasiness at the swelling of industrial populations, a terror of their potential political influence and their moral condition, and yet no one more warmly praised industrialization, urban progress, mechanization, and consolidation of every description. This paradox was thoroughly liberal. Manchester proposing no remedies except a vague confidence in general public education and more of the hair of the dog that bit them. Right, so he's really wary of these sort of industrial populations, these industrial centers popping up, but he's super, super pro industry.
Yeah.
So he doesn't want to separate the two, right? He's very opposed to these people, increasing democratic, getting the right to vote and things like that. But he wants to keep promoting the things that are causing these populations to continue to exist. And his general remedy that I think we'll talk about later is, like he says, just sort of educate them better. But he doesn't really describe how exactly that's supposed to work. And reminded me a little bit of the Republic. We were
Yeah.
talking about last time. Oh, if you just educate them better, they'll become more morally perfect and will vote the way I want them to vote, or become less morally corrupt in some way. But yeah, he's just a very paradoxical thinker in a lot of what he's describing here.
Well, and I think that the point is well taken, though.
Hmm.
We're um, universal suffrage, expanding the vote. It can be dangerous.
Yeah.
And then having it, the more you have it as a true democracy, the more dangerous it is. Because what I mean by that is, our constitutional system is set up as a republic, not a democracy. But the more you expand that, I think those arguments are so much better.
Yeah.
I don't think that we should limit the categories of people that vote. I think we should limit the topics in which they have a direct vote for.
Hmm.
And you see these problems have come up in Missouri because they have these initiative petitions, which you only need a majority to pass, but they're a little difficult to get on the ballot, a statewide ballot. But not, if you have enough money and you have a faction that really
Hmm.
wants to get it on the ballot, you can you can get it on the ballot fairly easily, too easily, in my opinion. And that's why we have in the Missouri Constitution the right to smoke pot, the right to grow pot,
Hmm.
the right to distribute marijuana. And also, the initiative petition, which reversed the abortion restrictions,
Hmm.
which a lot of that had to do with the ballot language. And the constitutional amendment was pages and pages on the marijuana issue, but people are voting on one paragraph
Right.
summaries.
Right.
And so you see all that like in other states like California, the initiative petitions are crazy, and there's because it's a direct democracy, and I think that's really dangerous
Hmm.
when you have those issues being decided as opposed to a deliberative body that's representative, because that has like a filtering effect on it, so you don't have these swings back and forth as much, or you're not supposed to. So I think their point is well taken on that, but because he's making a big news, it's basically saying that universal suffrage is incompatible
Right.
with liberty. You know,
Right.
and I don't buy that, but I understand their concern when they're expanding the vote. They could see, well, right now the system works for some people.
Hmm.
The people that they supported in the society which they were in, and so I understand that they were nervous about that, but I don't support that at all. I don't
Yeah.
know.
And his discussion of sort of the technology point too reminded a little bit of some of the people that are sort of kind of on the right today. I think kind of like figures like Elon Musk, a lot of these sort of like techno, AI sort of people. Well, they'll criticize the left for some of like sort of the transhumanism type stuff, a lot of the transgenderism type stuff. But then they're the ones promoting, Elon Musk is a good example of this, right? He's come out very like anti-transgenderism, but he's come up very pro, Neuralink in people's brains, right? I think
Yep.
those things are more related, in sort of philosophy than people think, right? They say we can just change humanity in some way. So he's like opposed to one side of it, but very pro the other side, and not really reconciling the two in any meaningful way. And I think there's quite a lot of figures in sort of the Silicon Valley, right, that have popped up recently, where they're pretty good at sort of diagnosing like societal problems that they exist, but then they're very, very pro sort of the advance of technology and sort of societal factors that I think have caused a lot of those things to happen in the first place.
Well, Elon Musk is, I think, one of the more interesting modern philosophers.
Hmm.
I mean that honestly. He's well read.
Hmm.
He's read. I know he's read like Kierkegaard and Hegel, Plato. Um, he's spent a lot of time reading really important philosophical texts, and he thinks deeply about these issues. Having said that, he worries me a little bit. I mean, in
Yeah.
the transgender issue, he has these. He's either going to be great long term, or he's going to destroy us all. He has this humanism, um, that he has this value of what he calls consciousness, human
Hmm.
consciousness, and that's why he wants to go to Mars, and now he switched that to the moon because Mars is really impractical. I mean, the moon isn't really super practical either, but it can get done a lot quicker. Where you have human settlement on the moon, so if something catastrophic happens on Earth, then you preserve human consciousness, and that's why
Right.
you want
Right.
interplanetary. But he has, and he has a real strong emphasis on seeking truth, and that's what his issue is with the transgenderism, because there's a falseness to it. But the Neuralink stuff is really fascinating and wonderful and dangerous at the same time, because his plan, his hope is that we will all have chips implanted in our brains.
Hmm.
And one when you look at it, it's like, well, that's really dystopian. Or what's really the difference between that and staring at your phone half the day?
Right.
I mean, you're just putting it in your head instead of looking at it with your eyes.
Hmm.
So yeah, you can really be super productive, but but those guys, the Silicon Valley guys, there's some deep thinkers out there, and they're coming up with some really interesting philosophical concepts, and and they've read, a lot of the founders type stuff. You really listen to some of their interviews, the ones that are granting interviews. There's some of the really big tech leaders. It's some of the deepest. They're really the public intellectuals of today.
Hmm.
Who else is even talking about those types of deep philosophical issues other than these tech bros?
Right.
I don't know of any of them. And they're talking about Tolkien and quite commonly, and some of them are coming back to Christianity or to Catholicism, which is really interesting.
Hmm.
When they maybe were raised loosely as Christians, so it's a fascinating development,
Yeah.
and and it could be terribly dangerous.
Yeah.
I'm firmly convinced that these robots that Musk is developing are going to be in most households certainly within 10 years,
Hmm.
if not 5 years, where it's going to be about $5,000 to have a personal butler.
Yeah.
And when you do the math, they would clean your house, they cut your yard, they could change your oil. I mean, think of all the tasks that you would hire others to do. And now we have Uber Eats, delivering your food. Or you have Uber, whatever it is, whoever does the grocery shopping for you.
Hmm.
Walmart has the shoppers. When you add up all that stuff, because that robot can go in your self-driving vehicle and go pick up your groceries.
Right.
And if you forget something, you can immediately, communicate with. Oh no, wait, I don't want that apple. I don't want Honeycrisp. I want, whatever,
Hmm.
whatever type. And is that worth $5,000?
Right.
Probably.
Yeah.
I'm opposed to it because these robots will eventually murder us all. But but then I was thinking, there'd be I always thought America would be unconquerable because the size and scope of it and how everybody has a weapon. Not everybody, but especially in the rural areas, everybody's got to have a shotgun and rifles and all that stuff. But if you just send out weaponized Optimus Prime type robots that even if they just have blades on their arms, even if they don't have firearms, you just send them out as hunter killers into the rural areas, and they'd be unstoppable. They just slaughter. They could slaughter all the livestock.
Hmm.
You'd starve the whole country. I mean, think of how many would you really need to cut loose? I mean, it depends on your time frame, but that's coming.
Yeah.
Anyway,
That's I went down a really weird dark path there.
well, think about it. I
Yeah.
mean, if really, I was driving down to your brother's um, track meet down in Cape Girardeau, so it's about a little over an hour drive through,
Right.
on the interstate, but it's farmland and beautiful countryside. And I thought, no, you can never invade this country. And I thought, shoot, the robots, especially if they're solar powered, if they have a solar panel or whatever, and you don't have to bring them back to charge them or refuel them or whatever, they could just go on killing. And
Yeah.
there's nothing you can do about it. If you're just in a homestead, they're going to come and slaughter us all.
Yeah.
What would stop the Chinese from doing that? You just you cut loose 1 million of them
Hmm.
and just say kill all humans.
Well, that's uplifting. Uh, yeah.
But
I
why,
think yeah. Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't even know what started that rant. But,
I think I was talking about Musk and Neuralink, and then we just went down that path. But no, I think you're right that that's definitely a possibility. Um,
by
I
the way,
just
our hometown just announced a data center
mm-hmm.
going in here. There's been big controversy about it. They announced some of the details of it. It's a $6 billion investment,
Wow.
which will generate over the next 20 years, $1.3 billion worth of tax revenue for local taxing districts.
Wow.
And that includes some sort of tax abatement on personal property, which are the computer units, which would be a great benefit to the data center. But just the property taxes alone on the building and the structure and the utility fees and everything like that would be, hundreds of millions of dollars
Wow.
over 10 years for sure.
Yeah.
So this is big business, is big time stuff that's hitting home to our hometown. It's a fascinating development.
Right. Right.
Anyway, we'll move on.
Yes. Well, speaking of sort of pessimistic takes, sort of going back to Macaulay here,
Yes.
he talks about utilitarianism sort of from a pessimistic view, right? Because he sort of attacks Mill and sort of the utilitarians because they assume that people will act more rationally than Macaulay thinks they will. He says, if you set up this utilitarian system, well, that's predicting that they're going to choose sort of the greatest long-term good. He says, well, that's not really how people act. It's sort of just going to term this demagoguery. If you have all of these sort of systems in place where people can abuse them, it's going to happen. So that was his main opposition to utilitarianism. And that's really what it seems like Kirk is saying is Macaulay's chief service to the conservative cause on page 169, right? This sort of attack of utilitarianism, this defense against it in England, not from a more optimistic point of view, right? Not from the idea, oh, we need to uplift human nature, right? You shouldn't look at things, this sort of cut and dry, but really from a more pessimistic place than Mill looked at things, saying, well, this would never work because people would just battle it out and just choose the most immediate short-term good for themselves and act entirely selfishly. So he's really, really very critical of utilitarianism from that point.
Well, he makes a great point because the criticism of the monarch is, well, if you have the powers concentrated on this monarch or this aristocracy, group of people, they're more likely to operate in their own selfish self-interest. And while he acknowledges that, he also acknowledges, well, they also have other motivations, maybe benefit society, maybe to do the right thing. But the same criticism can be leveled at a democracy. What's to stop the 51% of the people just doing what's in their own good, and subjugating everybody else and taking away freedoms and just voting, free stuff for them.
Right.
So he makes a great point there, using their argument against them, and that is a great service.
Yeah. And then that kind of moves us on to
they're dangerous too, and that's the problem with some of these. These guys like these software, titans, as they just want to maximize efficiency, and that's dangerous too, because that's just a utilitarian, anti-human, ultimately philosophy, and that's the real danger.
Right, right. But that kind of moves us, unless you have anything else to add about Macaulay here.
Nope.
That brings us to James Fenimore Cooper. And I really like this quote that he starts this section with on 171, very much along those same lines that you were just talking about. But he says, in democracies, there's a besetting disposition to make public opinion stronger than the law. This is the particular form in which tyranny exhibits itself in a popular government. For wherever there is power, there will be a disposition to abuse it. Whoever opposes the interests or wishes of the public, however right in principle or justifiable by circumstances, finds little sympathy. For in a democracy, resisting the wishes of the many is resisting the sovereign in his caprices. Right? So that same argument, like, well, if you oppose monarchy because it's just the will of one guy doing whatever he wants, well, that exact same thing can happen in a democracy, and in some ways much more so, because now you're not just opposing one person, you're opposing, well, we have decided, we as the majority, we can do whatever we want. And that's really where Cooper, as we're talking about here, his critique of democracy, right, in favor of liberty, right, in the sense that democracy can inhibit liberty in exactly this way.
Oh, for sure. And the that's really, I went on a rant last time about the direct election of senators, so I won't go down that path again. But I'm also opposed to the over polling. It's like the every issue you have to do a public opinion poll, and the reporters and so-called journalists are never stop asking, well, why are you doing this when this poll says it's unpopular? Well, maybe because it's the right thing to do, jerk. I mean, maybe it's more efficient. Maybe, a majority of the public don't even know enough about this. And maybe you're just asking people off the cuff and they're like, yeah, it sounds good.
Yeah.
Is that really, I mean, that's really what a public opinion poll is. Well, the way you ask it, it sounds good. But I think if I answered a poll and they said, well, do you in favor of X? Like if you ask me, now, are you in favor of this data center in your town? I don't know. I don't know what the details are.
Yeah.
But if they would say, well, are you in favor of $6 billion investment in your community? yeah, I think it sounds good,
Hmm.
but what does that mean? When you aggregate all those answers, he makes this quote makes a big, great argument that, public opinion is now stronger than the law.
Hmm.
Oh, the public is in favor of it. So yes. And then when you combine that, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, with no limiting like religious beliefs
Hmm.
in modern society. It was bad enough when this book was written or when the authors were originally discussing it. It's horrible now,
Hmm.
where nobody, seems to have any sort of restriction on what they think the government should do based upon religion.
Yeah.
And that's just evil. It's evil to take all this money for one group of people and just dump it on the other group of people just because they support you, which is what's happening now. It's odd.
Yeah. And that's really what he says here. And I'll have to pick up some of his books. I see them around all the time, but
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever actually read one of Cooper's books, especially The American Democrat. I think it seems like is his most political work. And he says, basically nobody's read that. I think that's where the Mencken reference comes in a
Yes.
little bit later. He says, well, he wanted to promote that and put out an edition. But at page 175, I think talking about this, 'cause he says The American Democrat, this book is really about what are the bounds of democracy, right? So there have to be some limits here. And I like this quote, sort of in the middle of the page, 175. He says, it ought to be impressed on every man's mind in letters of brass that in a democracy the public has no power that is not expressly conceded by the institutions, and that this power, moreover, is only to be used under the forms prescribed by the Constitution. All beyond this is oppression when it takes the character of acts, and not unfrequently when it is confined to opinion. And he says, he goes on, well, how can you be convinced that these sort of limits are good? And he says, well, that's where you have sort of these outside of political institutions, right, by the bounds of morality and religion. Well, that's how you recognize what there are good things to have limits, right? Those are sort of extra political things that you have to consider. But really, the political workings are within bounds, right? Democracy cannot do everything. That's why we have the Constitution. That's why we have these social institutions all throughout our country, is to account for things and to prevent people from just doing whatever the 51% want to do at any given moment in time, right? That's why we don't just do public opinion polls in every single decision that we make in our country.
Yeah, but that's what we're doing now.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, I like this quote right beyond that. They make the point that he says the very existence of government infers inequality. I
Hmm.
never really thought about that before, but that's true. If you have a society structured enough to have a government, then there's already inequality because you have a government. You have to have somebody in charge and it administers the government. And so anyway, so it's just kind of a basic concept there. But
Yeah. And I like what he says, I think in that same paragraph, right? He says, we adopt the popular polity not because it is perfect, but because it is less liable to disturb society than
yeah,
is any other, right?
yeah,
Not just because we think that the will of the majority is 100% right, but that if the majority has decided something, it's less likely to overthrow all of society because the
mhm.
majority of people agree on it. That doesn't mean it's now unchangeable and whatever, right? We should be continuously evaluating all of these decisions and not just relying on the majority opinion. But that's why we decide things the way we do.
Yeah. And he segues into not advocating for what he would not say that we should have an aristocracy.
Hmm.
That term. He says we should have certain leaders that are he calls them gentlemen.
Hmm.
Like ladies and gentlemen. But and I agree with that concept. That's the ideal. Um, I don't know that we have many gentlemen in a leadership role in our country.
Hmm.
I think there's still some of them in local government. I've served with a lot of them, or as a city attorney in the local government. They're not all gentlemen or
Yeah.
or ladies, but there's a fair number of people still in America that are local officials who are just doing things out of a sense of duty. And so I think it still exists by and
Yeah.
large, the local level, school boards, all these, school cities and county. Not, of course, we see abuses and all that all over the place too. But I don't know what the percentage is nationwide. But they still exist. And if And if you ask any of them to run for Congress or Senate, they will absolutely say no.
Hmm.
And in Missouri, all those positions I mentioned are nonpartisan, so they don't have
Yeah.
to file as a Democrat or Republican. And I think that helps because they, are either leaning Democrat or Republican or whatever, but they can actually run for office, and they're not asked, do you support the president? They're asked, do you support this tax increase, or this initiative, or this building the civic center, or whatever the issues of the day are.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of benefit to that.
Yeah, and he kind of ties this idea of gentleman really to possession of property, right? He seems like he's kind of a defender of like landed estates, right? That you could have just sort of not literally a baron, but somebody sort of that sort of status, kind of like what you're describing, who isn't necessarily a political figure, but just has this sort of sway in a given society, in a local region, right? Just because he is sort of the biggest guy in town in some way. And he says in some ways, he describes this on page 178, just before we get into Tocqueville. But he says, perhaps without gentlemen, society bores itself to death. In such a people is no leaven of diversity, right? That you need some person who is sort of above, the majority of people, who just people respect in some way, who is sort of just a leading figure. And he says, in some ways, right, the lack of gentlemen is most conspicuous in rural regions and small towns and the great empty states of the West. But even in the older cities, society often seems declining into an ennui, formerly characteristic only of senescent peoples, for lack of leadership and tone. And that's when he gives the quote about the boredom. That there doesn't really seem to be a lot of guiding forces. And kind of back to what we were talking about earlier, it seems like a lot of those are these sort of online tech people now, who are these sort of, in some ways, the quote unquote gentlemen, even though I don't think they really fit this description, but they're the people who people listen to much more often now. These very, very uber wealthy people who have this immense reach, but it's a very different kind of gentleman than I think Cooper was talking about.
Well, they do remind me of the old English aristocracy,
Mm,
because they have, after they they create whatever tech company, and they go public, and now they're billionaires. And
mhm,
it seems to happen like they work and they work and work, and all of a sudden, after all that work, they're billionaires. And so now they have pretty almost unlimited wealth. I mean, like, they want to take a private plane anywhere in the world, they could just do it. They want to
mhm,
go anywhere, they want to do anything, they want to buy anything, they have enough money. And so that affords them a freedom to spend time reading Plato, considering these big issues. And I think some of it is ego, because now they're billionaires, and so God must have chosen. They're like the chosen people. Like, is it, is it, if they're skilled in this, then they're skilled in everything. But it reminds me a lot of the people that were super wealthy, in England, or even early America, or these big titans of industry. Who am I thinking of? Like, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I was just watching a documentary about that, railroad barons,
mhm.
and the
Like the
Rockefeller,
Rockefellers, yeah, I was about to say, yeah.
the oil and all that, Standard Oil, I guess. And so these are just a different variation of them, I think.
Hmm.
And they didn't always, they weren't always clean in getting their wealth. There's a lot of competition and some rough elbows and all that kind of stuff back then, and still today. But there's something to be there. I think I see parallels there.
Hmm.
And then we see, that the next generation. We haven't seen the next generation with these new guys, but we will, and see how those people with all their inherited wealth, what they do with it. And
Right,
it's almost always worse.
right.
So you'll live long enough to see that. I probably won't.
Right.
Uh,
But yeah,
they'll
talking about that.
they're tech babies and how they destroy the world,
Oof, yeah, no kidding. With their armies of robots. Um, it's a real threat.
battling each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that brings us then into Alexis de Tocqueville, talking about this boredom, right? This sort of ennui that sets in. And I really like his description of Tocqueville here. And I know we've talked about Tocqueville before in the podcast and our past seasons on politics and things like that. But his description here really is sort of painting him as a very, very unique political figure because he's the first to argue, sort of everybody thinks, well, there's sort of two things that happen to societies. Either a tyrant takes over or society completely collapses. He says Tocqueville's really unique idea is this democratic despotism. I've heard it called soft totalitarianism in other contexts. But the idea that, it won't be a single tyrant taking over, it won't be a complete societal collapse. But just as we move into modern life and all of these conveniences and things like that, there is just this general boredom that everything is just, well, why bother with anything at all? He says that's really the real threat, right? As things get more convenient, as things are more democratized and things like that, you lose sort of faith in institutions, right? These sort of civic institutions sort of collapse, right? Social ties sort of dissolve. And nobody really, one figure comes to power. It's just nobody really cares enough. And it's just sort of this malaise, this sort of general everywhere corruption that happens. And the state still exists, society still exists, it still continues on. But it just sort of stagnates. And I think that's only has been proven much more true, in the time since Tocqueville was writing and since Russell Kirk was writing.
Yeah, don't you think? I mean,
Yeah.
he predicted like it all,
Hmm.
how it's going to develop over time, and what he warned us, warned the country against, has happened, and it continues to happen. I
Right.
think it probably accelerated in the last 30 years.
Right. Yeah, because what he says, and I think he's very right on page 181, he says, the insidious vice of democracy, Tocqueville discerned, is that democracy preys upon itself and presently exists only corrupt and hideous, still perhaps preserving its essential characteristic of equality, but devoid of all of those aspirations toward liberty and progress which inspired its early triumph. He says you're kind of missing, right, this idea of liberty, right? And all you're left with, and I think this is very true, is this just pursuit of equality, right? You
Yeah.
don't really care about anything else, just sort of this leveling out across all of society. As long as everybody's equal, then we're doing fine, right? And that's really just how you get malaise, right? That's how you get
Right.
nobody ever doing anything because you're just trying to even everything out. There's no impetus to move forward, to do anything better because all of a sudden your ideals are to just make everybody the same, right? And that's the only goal of the society. The society's still there, it's still continuing, but it's not actually doing anything.
Yes. No, 100% good summary.
Yes. He says, yeah, he foresaw the coming of the social welfare state,
Yep.
right? The working from the top downwards, right? That's sort of what democracy generally becomes, right? You sort of envision it as sort of from the people up, but as society progresses, it increasingly is centralized from the top down,
Yep.
right? And again, it's not this tyranny; it's not one figure; it's just this general all of society from the top down, just trying to equalize everything.
And when he starts going into, I think it's like chapter one or page 185, where he starts
Hmm.
talking about the factors of, about the issues with democracy, where he says, first, democratic peoples have a deep founded dislike for hierarchy. And boy, isn't that true?
Hmm.
We really we have this almost as a nation we have this almost irrational hatred of anything hierarchical, like any
Hmm.
sort of, if anybody puts themselves, or if we put anybody above something, the first thing we want to do is we want to destroy them. They're too big for their britches. We need
Hmm.
to pull them down back to our level, I guess. And and Tocqueville, as the author says, repeatedly describes the function of an aristocracy as protecting freedom. That there will be people that will act as protectors that he calls aristocracy. But I guess the previous subject author, what's his name, would talk to them about them being gentlemen or
Hmm.
leaders, just civic-minded people as the protectors of freedom. But it's a similar concept: is that there's certain people that have a level of intelligence, competence, and honor to be those protectors. There is a need for, I don't know, I guess it's a higher class of people to
Hmm.
do that. And there's very few of us that are willing to put aside, petty uh, squabbles and make a decision for that benefits everybody. And I don't
Hmm.
know that I'm good enough to do that personally, and it takes a really good person and really intelligent, effective communicators to really be those protectors. And that's not everybody. That's a
Right.
small segment of the population has the capacity, let alone the willingness to do it.
Right.
And Tocqueville is correct in addressing that and recognizing that you need that.
Hmm.
If you don't have an upper echelon of people, and I'm not saying that they are kings, we can elect them, but we need to have those types of people in leadership roles. And
Hmm.
I don't think we recognize that as much as we should.
Right. And I think that's very related to the second point that he
Yeah.
talks about 186. He says, the second, the readiness of democratic states to concentrate in the central government, all real power soon withers at the root. True democracy, which is a product of local institutions and
Yeah.
self-reliance. And what he means by this is like, well, there's this really big impetus, right? If you have this democracy, well, everything's for the people, right?
Mhm.
Therefore, the federal government or the highest level of government, whatever the system is, it should be providing things for the people. And you
Yeah.
have, people run on, well, everything needs to be self-reliant, but then once they get into power, they think, well, if I'm using the power for the people, then it's a good thing. That's what I was elected to do. And so there's this great desire to just take more and more money and just give it to the people and more programs to provide for all of these other things. And it seems to align with the values, but it's completely different to the working of society. And I like his example. He says, the spectacle of the states of the American Union today, and again, this is early 50s, he says, resentful yet mendicant like, fearful of consolidation, but cursed with an insatiable appetite for federal grants and aid, is sufficient illustration of Tocqueville's observation. And I think that's spot on.
Yeah.
I think even more so today, a lot of, American people like to talk about, oh, well, everything is much better in America because it's all, at the state level or at the local level. But then you look at what the state and the local level are doing is that they're just constantly appealing the federal government for grant money for this project or that project. And it's not actually a self-reliant project. It's just looking at, what is the top level of society and how can it give me more money to
Yeah.
do X, Y, and Z.
And this is runs parallel to another book I'm reading right now, which is a wonderful book. It's a biased history of the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
It's like an advocacy for it,
Hmm.
and it's called Triumph.
Hmm.
2,000-year history of the Catholic Church, and I really enjoy it because it's obviously biased in favor of Catholicism. And I just finished a chapter about Luther,
Hmm.
and I don't think he actually defames Luther, Martin Luther, but because I think it's accurate, because I think Luther, kind of certainly had some crazy attributes about him. Anyway, so my point is, let me get to the subject. Is he makes a really interesting point about in the history of the of European governance and the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation and all that. And he made a really interesting observation, and I've heard it before, but he articulated it great about the changing of the social services from the church-sponsored support for the poor,
Hmm.
widows, and children, and the ill and the infirm, which was done exclusively by the Catholic Church in France and Germany and Italy and all that, where the governments weren't really doing any of that. It was all funded
Hmm.
through, and it was tithes, or he had a great defense of indulgences, which I've
Hmm.
never actually heard anybody really make a really spirited,
Hmm.
vociferous defense of indulgences, which is
You should
really
talk to my friends more often. I hear those defenses all the time.
I I have not. So it was really interesting. I was like, oh, that's an interesting perspective of it.
Hmm.
And anyway, so I think that, and then I'm hearing this, I'm reading this Tocqueville about, the expansion of these, the democracy, if people can vote to say, well, take this from them and give it to these other people who are deserving or whatever. And there's a danger to that, as I mentioned earlier. If it's not done by the government at all, then it's a limited government, and of course you still need some way for society to help the people in need. But then the question is, who has the appropriate role? And I'm not saying we should have, the Catholic necessarily, the Catholic Church be as uniform and as powerful as it was in Europe
Hmm.
in 1300s or whatever. But I think having the government fill that role is more dangerous.
Hmm.
And also it gets people off the hook. Well, I pay taxes, you know, and it's like a lot of times they don't even pay taxes when it comes down to it because they're below a certain threshold.
Right.
Well, that's why I pay taxes for it. And like, actually, you don't. You're actually not contributing anything to anybody. And so, but you are voting for taking that money from those people and giving it to those other people over there,
Right.
to yourself,
Yeah.
or to your family.
Yeah.
And that's really, almost inevitable, as
Yeah.
Tocqueville was talking about.
Yeah. On the point about the church, it reminds me of one of my friends here at University of Florida. He was, well, still is currently, I guess, in the political science PhD program. He was just accepted to Hamilton's PhD
Oh,
in history of ideas, so he's switching over there.
nice.
And he's got a really interesting project that he's worked on in the past. He's been looking at Joseph de Maistre, who's a French political thinker, very conservative guy. He describes his ideas as what's the term he uses? Like ecclesiastical liberalism,
Huh.
essentially arguing very, very similar to this that de Maistre tried to preserve liberty in the way that he saw it was by having a greater recognition of sort of the dependence of sort of the political on the religious. That in
Yeah.
some ways, that these political leaders recognize, well, hey, the Pope is over me in some way, right? Not that he's specifically integrated into the political framework, but recognizing like, well, there are moral bounds to what I can and cannot do, and
Yeah.
having like religious authorities be able to step in and reprimand
Right.
political leaders for these things, right? These sort of bounds on the political that were in place, in the
Yeah.
past. And he says that's just something we've lost. And he says he's really arguing in favor of that. And that's a way of preserving liberty. But now, and this is kind of to Tocqueville's third point,
Yeah.
he says that democratic nations are enamored of uniformity, standardization. They hate the eccentric, the grand, the private, the mysterious. Right? You
Yeah.
can't have a system like that in democratic nations, really at all, where you're sort of appealing to these religious institutions to something outside, because that's not a standard thing. That's not something that
Yeah.
can be uniform. It's not something that you have control of politically. It's this mysterious outside force, and we can't have those sort of things working in our society. We have to tamp down in those institutions, and that's what really leads to this democratic despotism.
Yes. Good point. It's an interesting an interesting point of view. Of course, the danger of it is that you have maybe a corrupt religious leader, and then
Right.
then they're abrogating their power, and they're not elected. There's no public accountability because they're in the Catholic churches, their system, they're selected by the College of Cardinals,
Hmm.
who of course are appointed by the previous pope. So there are practical issues with that as well. But it certainly worked sometimes
Yeah. Yeah.
in the history of Europe, where the Pope threatened excommunication, or actually did excommunicate different world leaders, kings, princes, or whatever, to
Hmm.
get them to act in a more moral, humane, and appropriately religious way. So
Right.
that's an interesting concept. I don't know how under what mechanism you could try to bring it back.
Yeah. It'd be very, very difficult. You need a mass conversion of like the entire population of a state, I think,
Um,
to actually recognize that as a possibility.
First, religious revivalism. Second, papal authority.
Right. But that does kind of go into the next point here in this next section as we sort of wrap up, especially on
Yeah.
page 190, where Tocqueville's saying, well, these things aren't inevitable. There are sort of barriers to this slide into democratic despotism. And he says on page 190 that the chief is religion among the props of order in democratic societies. That he says, that there is some reassurance, when Tocqueville was touring America, that the religion is strong enough to withstand against this, that people do care about the dictates of morality and things like that. I don't know if Tocqueville was around today, if he would say the same thing of traveling around the United States, but at least back when he was sort of describing American society, that was the strongest defense against right, this despotism that he saw, because there is something outside of just what the majority wants, right, and that is these religious principles that are sort of unchanging, and that is sort of the biggest defense against them. But then once you lose, faith, once you lose public interest in religion, well, then that defense is gone.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem that the Democratic Party has right now
Hmm.
is that if you look at the public polling within that party, very few of them are regular religious. They don't attend mass or church or any sort of religious service on any regular basis. Perhaps twice a year if they're not affiliated Christians. But even that might be a stretch for the majority of people that are Democrats in the Democratic Party, and certainly their activists
Hmm.
are not religiously oriented, except for those that may be Muslim in certain areas, where the concentration of them as Democratic voters. But the actual party apparatus, they don't have that controlling influence, that moderating, I guess you'd say not controlling,
Hmm.
moderating influence. Now, of course, I don't know how many Republican elected officials really follow their faith. I don't know. I get
Yeah.
cynical. I'm kind of down on it right now. So it's my pessimistic podcast episode because it's like, do they really religious now? Like our senators. Well, Schmidt, I think, is Catholic,
Hmm.
and then Hawley um, has become almost like a preacher. Have
Yeah.
you noticed that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know what to think about that. I read his book, which is pretty
Hmm.
good. Really, really big on the Adam and Eve story, original sin, that kind of stuff, and he's speaking my
Hmm.
language, but a little odd. I'm a
Yeah.
little, a little. I mean, and of course, I've just said like they should be more bound by their religious beliefs, but I don't know what to think about that, about
Hmm.
how Hawley's proselytizing um, about religion as much as he
Yeah.
is.
It's a little bit sort of more old school American, I think.
Yeah.
Some of what he's saying is a lot similar to, those, sort of 19th century,
Yes.
American political speeches,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of the vibe I get. And, I don't really have a problem with it so much.
That's a
But yeah,
good
it
way to look
is,
at it.
you
He reminds me of like the politicians in the Civil War
hmm
era or before. Like
hmm
they could quote the Bible, fire and brimstone type stuff. Yeah,
hmm
that's a good point. Or even up to the 1920s.
yeah,
Yeah, you're right. It is like old school. All right,
hmm
I'll put that because I don't disagree with anything he's saying.
hmm
It's like, but I'm just like, it's just
yeah,
kind of different. And I don't think he was like that when he first came into
yeah,
office,
no,
not publicly.
yeah,
Maybe this has always been his thing.
hmm
But let's say the last year, he's been really a lot more
yeah.
outspoken about it. So
And
that's
things
that's
have
a thing.
definitely changed, I think, politically. This is a little bit more optimistic point, but he was elected what first in 2016, I think,
Mhm.
and then 6 year term reelected in 2022. And I think the
Yes.
political climate was just incredibly different in 2016. I mean, obviously so. I mean, I think that was sort of one of the peaks of. Well, not quite the peak, but the sort of new atheists were very much on the scene. Christianity was very, very unpopular, I think, in the 2000s into the 2010s, and it's
Mhm.
becoming more mainstream into the 2020s at least. So it's definitely been a shift in politics overall. I don't know if it's a
Yeah.
long-term upward trend, but at least over the past couple years, it seems.
Well, he and Schmidt both have kind of an interesting conservative philosophy where they remind me like of Scalia's decisions.
Hmm.
Like Scalia was a constitutionalist, and sometimes they would cut one way politically in a decision, and the other times they would cut other ways. Like he was uh, very helpful to the criminal defense bar in some issues because he wanted to have if there's constitutional limitations on search and seizure, he doesn't care if it set somebody free or not, that
Hmm.
if there was a constitutional issue. And so it would cut, like I said, it wouldn't just be a rubber stamp Republican decisions. It was a constitutional decision. So I'm seeing that same kind of, um, there's a consistency in their philosophy, but they're pro-family and
Hmm.
their tax policies are not just conservative cut taxes and no spending on, social programs. Both of them are in favor of some social spending that you wouldn't normally think of because they're pretty conservative law and order kind of guys.
Hmm.
But they have this interesting mix, which I have to think has been influenced by the religious views. So I guess maybe I'll be a little bit more hopeful about it going into the future. At least with our local guys.
Right.
But I don't know about the other people. I don't
Yeah.
know. I
Yeah.
don't know. JD Vance gives a great speech that
Hmm.
has religious overtones. Rubio's been on fire
Yeah.
since he's been Secretary of State, and he talks about religious issues
Yeah.
affecting his philosophy, especially anti-communist actions and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
it's
Well, I think
um,
I've told the story here about the story I heard of J.D. Vance reading the entirety of St. Augustine's City of God, right, which is
yeah,
pretty impressive. And he, seems to know a little bit about, more than a little bit about Catholic theology. I mean, he got into that debacle of, quoting the Ordo Amoris, the order of love, in terms of immigration debates, right? And that's a very traditional theological idea. So sometimes I'm more hopeful, sometimes I'm less. But if you were going to put on a show about things, I don't think putting on a show about reading St. Augustine's City of God or the
yeah,
Ordo Amoris would be the way to go. I think you'd
right.
temper things down a little bit. So that makes me think maybe those things are a little bit more sincere in some ways.
Well, the last rumor I heard about JD Vance is he might not run in
Really?
2028. Oh, because his wife's having their fourth kid.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And who was it? It was Mark Halperin was saying, he's a political commentator guy, um, who I enjoy listening to. He says, there's a thing about a person that has four children. They really like their kids. If you have four of them, you really like them. You want to spend a lot of time with them.
Hmm.
Well, that's true because I have four kids. And so it wouldn't, he says it may not, he may not run to be president because, you can't spend that time with your kids.
Right.
That's a sacrifice. And maybe he has different priorities. So wouldn't that be something?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, so all right, so I'm going to be a little more hopeful at the end
No,
here.
there you go. There
I
you
think
go.
we're about to finish
Yeah,
off.
no, I don't think there's too much else to say here. He lists a couple other things that are sort of these defenses
Oh,
against this
yes, yes,
despotism. One of those is laws and customs, right? Sort of the
yes.
habits of people. That's very similar to Burke, like we were talking about. And says constitutions may serve to tide nations over times of passion or folly, right? If you have good sort of balances set up into your sort of political structure, that is a very good thing. Going back to the idea of sort of the vestiges of aristocracy can
Mhm.
be employed to temper the impulse of majorities, right? Sort of these just extra political figures that can sort of help stop this downsliding. But
Public education, because
yeah,
that always helps.
yes,
Not Of course, I'm really down on public education now,
yeah.
but
And then
well, I'm going to say one more thing about
mhm,
the AI stuff. One of the really great things is that once we're able to fully implement it, we're going to be able to really reform the educational system so that each student is going to have their own individual curriculum that is going to be able to be tailored to them without very much effort at all at the elementary and secondary school level.
mhm,
And they'll be able to have accelerated teaching. You still have if you have an excellent teacher, they're going to be able to, or they'll be really able to move fast with these kids, much faster than the dead time that half the schools are nowadays.
mhm,
And I think the AI is really going to be able to help do real time evaluations, and develop them. Similar to like I do that Duolingo thing,
yeah,
and I guess I'm not really terribly diligent about it, but you can tell it's stringing me along. It's helping me learn it step by step. It's a curriculum, and based upon the things I get wrong, it goes back and circles back and correct. It has me correct my mistakes or anything, and that's a really easy AI program. But you can do that with every curriculum, every course all across this country, and I think that's really going to be hitting us in the next few years.
yeah,
And so, in theory, he is right, although I think he's wrong now,
mm,
that our public education system can ameliorate these dangers in a democracy. I think an effective public education system, and it has to be patriotic in order to effectively. And what I mean by that is supporting the Constitution and limits on power, not advocating for socialism, communism, Marxism, and direct democracy, which because those are all dangerous. because it all depends on what you're teaching. Now I'm sounding like Plato. That we can control people, but
Hmm.
I think it has to be truth based.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing that I think kind of summarizes, what he says. This is towards the bottom of 193. He says, above all, the well-wisher of modern society should endeavor strenuously to encourage and shelter individual differences, variety of character. Uniformity is the death of high human striving. And he says, as long as we are trying to preserve the things that make us different from one another, we're doing something good. And that is sort of the best thing that you can do to stop this democratic despotism, right? Because
yeah,
in this drive for just absolute equality, the ideal to make everybody the same in every single facet of their life, that's just what leads to this malaise, this stagnation, this just lack of functioning. As long as we keep, in some capacity, there are some institutions, social or political or religious, that emphasize individual differences. Those are sort of what you have to hold on to and keep promoting, because that is, what can really the only thing that can stop this continual process.
yes, good point.
Thank you. Any other final thoughts from this chapter?
No, do you have any other final thoughts?
No,
Or
I
is
don't
that
think so.
your final thought?
No, I enjoyed it. I really like the section on Tocqueville, of course. I think he's a very, very good thinker, and he needs to be read more often.
Mm. More often or by more people?
By more people, probably. No. Do you have any other thoughts?
No.
All right. Well, then this has been season 14, episode 6 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I have been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.